Israel's Prime Minister Yair Lapid made a rare reference recently to the country's widely suspected nuclear arsenal. He said this during a speech last week. Now, normally, Israeli prime ministers are very careful about what they say about the N-word. Speaking at an event to mark a change of leadership at the country's Atomic Energy Commission, Lapid referred to Israel's defensive as well as offensive capabilities, but he didn't stop there. He went on to call something called other capabilities. Now, this use of the phrase other capabilities was understood to be a reference to Israel's nuclear weapons. Lapid said, and I quote, "The operational arena in the invisible dome above us is built on defensive and offensive capabilities, and with what the foreign media tends to call other capabilities. These other capabilities keep us alive and will keep us alive so long as we and our children are here." Unquote. Now, Israel is widely believed to possess a few hundred nuclear weapons, developing the technology all the way from the 1960s. Unlike most other nuclear weapon states, Israel has never formally declared that it has or it possesses nuclear weapons. Neither is there any formal record of how many nuclear weapons Israel has. On Crux Decode, what does Israel's nuclear weapons program look like? This policy of walking on two boats at the same time, how sustainable is it? And most importantly, what would public acknowledgement of nuclear weapons mean for a region that is as volatile as the Middle East? Israel pursues a policy of opacity, meaning Israeli leaders, when they are pushed, they would rather make oblique or ambiguous references to nuclear weapons without saying anything direct. Now, the first such statement was made back in the early 1960s by the then junior defense minister Shimon Peres, who said that Israel would certainly not be the first one to introduce nuclear weapons into the region. Now, this has become a standard phrase for all Israeli leaders subsequently. Most recently, former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert appeared to acknowledge the nuclear capability of Israel when he listed his country, along with the United States, Russia, and France, as having nuclear weapons, though later he attempted to row back from those comments. These comments were made in an interview to German television. Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister and one of the longtime rulers of Israel, had once referred to Israel as a nuclear power during a presentation to his cabinet before he corrected himself to say energy power. The Israeli nuclear weapons program dates back to the mid-1950s, when the country's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, began to explore a nuclear insurance plan in order to offset the combined conventional superiority of the Arab states. Ben-Gurion realized that as long as the Palestinian cause was a potent rallying point for all the Arab states, then he will need some kind of an X factor as a collective deterrent. As historian Avner Cohen writes, Ben-Gurion's determination to launch the nuclear project was the result of strategic intuition and obsessive fears. It was not born of a well-thought-out plan. He believed that Israel needed nuclear weapons as an insurance if it could no longer compete with the Arab world in an arms race. Also, nuclear weapons are a weapon of last resort in case of an extreme military emergency. Ben-Gurion then tapped into Shimon Peres, who would later become Israel's prime minister himself, to lead the nuclear weapons program. Under Shimon Peres' leadership, Israel purchased a substantial package, including a research reactor and a plutonium separation technology from France in 1957. It also bought 20 tons of heavy water from Norway in 1959. The ground for the Negev Nuclear Research Center was broken near Dimona in early 1958. This facility, for close to 10 years, was marked as a civilian nuclear facility, with even the United States, Israel's closest ally, having no clue about what exactly was going on in this 3-floor underground facility. Since the late 1960s, every Israeli government has practiced a policy of nuclear ambiguity. It's called amimut in Hebrew. It deliberately obscures whether Israel actually possesses nuclear weapons, and if so, how its arsenal is operationalized. Since the mid-1960s, this policy has been publicly expressed and recently affirmed by former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the famous phrase that we won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Israel's policy of deliberate ambiguity was enshrined during the country's negotiations with the United States over the purchase of F-4 Phantom aircraft, which happened in the late 1960s. The United States and Israel's competing interpretations over the term introduce nuclear weapons that threatened to derail the arms sale. During a meeting at the Pentagon in November of 1968, Israel's ambassador to the United States at that time, Yitzhak Rabin, who later went on to become Israel's prime minister, would say that he would not consider a weapon that had not been tested to actually be a weapon. In other words, Israel construed its pledge not to be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons in that region to actually mean that introduction was not about physical possession, but about public acknowledgement of that possession. After the end of the Cold War, Israel began to fear that the United States and its tacit support for Israel's undeclared nuclear program would soon fade. America at that time had been actively engaging with other Middle East powers for a two-state solution, as was seen in the Camp David talks. The Clinton administration had made a public commitment to make the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone. As a result, Israel had requested that every American president since Bill Clinton sign a letter indicating that any future U.S. arms control efforts would not affect Israel's nuclear weapons program. Over the past several decades, news media reports, think tanks, authors, and analysts have presented a wide range of possibilities of just how big the Israeli nuclear stockpile is. At the lower end, it's somewhere in the 70 to 80 warheads category, and in the upper end, it is about 400 warheads. So typically, many experts suggest that the actual figure of Israeli nuclear warheads could be anything between 100 to 200. Delivery vehicles for these warheads have also been listed depending on which source you look up. Aircraft, ballistic missiles, artillery, tactical or even battlefield weapons like artillery shells and landmines, and most recently, there's also the Israeli ability to use sea-based cruise missiles to deliver nuclear warheads. But the problem is this: in the absence of any public document, and because of this deliberate policy of opacity or amimut, it becomes extremely difficult to make an educated estimate of how many nuclear weapons Israel actually possesses. But one thing is very clear: as Yair Lapid mentioned in his speech last week, Israel has always planned for and will deploy, or certainly will not hesitate to deploy if necessary, a collective deterrent against the Arab world. And this is even more so if its core security interests are threatened.